In just 9 unforgettable minutes, everything changed. It was supposed to be a typical political town hall. 500 of the nation's most powerful leaders seated beneath the cold glow of television lights, with millions of Americans watching from their living rooms. But what they witnessed that night was anything but ordinary. Ron DeSantis stood tall, his voice sharp as steel, mocking Trump's border plan with words meant to slice, to humiliate. And then, J.D. Vance rose. His voice trembled. His eyes glistened. And for those 9 minutes, time seemed to stop. Every camera lens, every heartbeat, every breath in that great hall froze, as Vance spoke not for himself, not for party or power, but for the people who felt forgotten, the people who believed their voices were too small to be heard. What did he say that shattered the silence? And why did millions across America say they would never forget it? And as you join us on this journey, we invite you to remember, while this dramatization is fictional, inspired by the passion and struggles of real Americans, the emotions it stirs, the hope, the anger, the tears, are very real. This story is crafted to honor those voices and remind us what true courage sounds like. Stay with us, because some moments don't just tell a story, they remind us who we are. The Grand Hall stood in a hush, a temple of democracy polished to a mirror's sheen. Marble columns soared toward the arched ceiling, catching the glare of camera lights that blinked and flickered like watchful, unblinking eyes. Flags lined the walls, heavy with history, their fabric creased from years of solemn duty, their stars and stripes dimmed ever so slightly by time. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Outside the hall's towering glass doors, Washington, D.C. lay under a cold, brittle night. A breeze carried the faint sound of distant sirens and the low murmur of protesters who had gathered beyond the barricades. Inside, the audience filled every seat. Senators, governors, business leaders, 500 faces lit by the glow of television screens, each hiding their own expectations, their own silent judgments. But beyond these walls, the weight of this night stretched far wider. Across the nation, factories stood silent. Conveyor belts that once roared with American industry had long fallen still, their silence a ghostly reminder of jobs lost and towns forgotten. In border communities, families gathered at kitchen tables, radios crackling with news of this town hall. Mothers clutched children tighter. Fathers stared at screens, their faces lined with worry. And in countless living rooms across America, families watched. The retired steel worker in Ohio, the farmer in Texas, the single mother in Michigan, all waiting, hoping, fearing what this night might bring. Backstage, behind a velvet curtain heavy as lead, J.D. Vance stood motionless. His hands, normally steady, flexed slightly as he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The scent of the polished wood floor mixed with the faint metallic tang of the stage lights heating the room. He could hear the low buzz of cameras powering up, the subtle shuffle of the moderator's papers, and beyond that, 1,000 eyes, unseen but felt, waiting. His mind wandered, just for a moment, to where this all began. A boy in a forgotten Ohio town. He could almost see it now, the hollowed-out factory with its broken windows, the crumbling brick of the diner where his mother once worked double shifts, the muddy streets where he'd walked home in hand-me-down sneakers 2 sizes too big. He remembered the sound of his mother crying behind a closed door, the kind of tears she never let him see. What would she think of tonight, he wondered. Would she believe her son now stood on this stage, carrying the hopes of families like theirs? Families long ignored, long abandoned? The curtain stirred as a stagehand passed, and J.D. caught a glimpse of the hall. The moderator adjusted his tie. Ron DeSantis sat poised, hands folded, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, already measuring the battlefield. J.D. inhaled deeply, willing himself steady. He could feel the weight of this moment pressing against his chest. Not just the weight of politics, but the weight of every promise made and broken. Every job lost to a foreign factory. Every border left unguarded while families paid the price. He glanced at the small note card in his pocket. Not for reminders of what to say, but because on its back was scrawled a single line from a letter he carried in his heart. A widow's plea, a line he would need to remember when the storm came. The cameras blinked again, red lights signaling that America was watching. And still that silence, vast, expectant, heavy with the question no one dared to speak. What will happen when these two men clash tonight? The silence of the hall, that heavy, breathless pause, didn't last. It broke with the confident, deliberate steps of Ron DeSantis as he rose from his chair and walked toward the podium. The faint sound of his polished shoes on the wooden floor echoed through the vast chamber like a challenge thrown down. The audience shifted in their seats, the weight of the moment settling more heavily as DeSantis took his position, shoulders squared, gaze steady. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, part anticipation, part unease. The cameras blinked red again, their lenses trained on the man who now commanded the room. DeSantis gripped the sides of the podium, not with nervousness, but with ownership. His expression was calm, controlled, but his eyes held a glint of steel. Then his voice came, sharp, clear, slicing through the charged air like a blade. How many more broken promises will we endure? His words fell hard, each syllable deliberate, measured, meant to wound. How many more walls that go unfinished? How much more debt piled on our children's backs before we admit the truth? His voice rose, not in anger, but with the precision of a man who knew exactly where to aim. He wasn't speaking to the audience in front of him alone. His words were meant for the cameras, for the millions beyond these walls who watched, waited, judged. Vance stood just beyond the curtain's edge, the words striking him like a bitter wind. He could see the shift in the room, feel it even, that subtle tilt as DeSantis's barbs found their mark. The crowd's murmur grew, the tension thickening as though the very air had weight. DeSantis continued, his tone steady, his gaze sweeping the hall like a general surveying a field of battle. We were promised security at our borders, he pressed on, each word tapping into buried frustrations. Promised jobs would come back, that factories would hum again. And what do we have? A wall half built, a debt that could drown generations, and a nation divided. JD's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, unseen by the cameras but felt in the tension of his stance. He watched as DeSantis's words began to take root, saw the nods from some in the audience, the slight incline of heads that suggested agreement, or perhaps just the stirring of old doubts brought back to the surface. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a reporter's laptop screen glowed with the first of many headlines already taking shape. DeSantis draws blood in opening salvo. Another screen flashed with the words, DeSantis takes aim at broken promises. JD could feel it, the storm gathering. The moment that would test not just his voice, but his resolve, his very reason for standing on this stage tonight. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing not with rebuttals, but with memories. The Ohio mill, the widow's letter, the faces of those he swore he'd represent when no one else would. DeSantis paused now, letting the weight of his words hang, letting the silence after them speak almost as loudly as the accusations themselves. He stepped back slightly, his point made, his eyes resting briefly on the curtain's edge, where he knew JD waited. There was no smile, no smirk, only the satisfaction of a man who believed he had struck first and struck true. And in that instant, J.D. Vance stepped forward, leaving the shadows of the wings behind. His heart pounded, but his purpose was clear. The time for reflection had ended. The time to speak for those unseen, unheard, had come. As Ron DeSantis stepped back from the podium, his final words hanging in the air like smoke from a fired shot, J.D. Vance felt the weight of the room settle upon him. The moment had come. The storm was his to face and his to answer. He took a steadying breath, his heart pounding not with fear, but with resolve forged in years of seeing promises broken and lives forgotten. It's not about him, it's about the people. The words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder of why he was here tonight. This wasn't about trading barbs or winning headlines. This was about the families who had no stage, no cameras, no audience but the cold winds of forgotten towns and the ache of empty dinner tables. And as JD took his first step toward the podium, his mind reached back, unbidden but clear, to a day that had shaped him more than any speech ever could. He was a boy again, small in stature but wide-eyed, standing on the edge of the parking lot of the factory where his grandfather had once worked. He remembered the sound of the gates clanging shut, the loudspeakers crackling one last time, the men and women streaming out with slumped shoulders and empty eyes. He had watched them leave, carrying boxes filled with the scraps of their working lives. A photograph here, a thermos there. The kind of small things that didn't seem like much until they were all you had left. He could still see his mother standing beside him, tears slipping silently down her face as she gripped his hand too tightly. She had tried to hide it, tried to stay strong, but JD had seen. He had felt that sorrow like a stone in his chest, too heavy for a boy to carry, but one he had borne ever since. And now as he stepped into the blinding lights of the stage, JD Vance carried that stone with him still. But it no longer weighed him down. It steadied him. The hall seemed to hold its breath as he emerged from the wings. The silence that greeted him was different from the one that had met DeSantis. This was not the charged pause before a strike, but the uncertain hush that comes when people don't know what to expect, when they aren't sure if what's coming will comfort or confront, heal or divide. JD moved toward the podium, his steps deliberate, his gaze steady. He could feel the eyes upon him, hundreds in the hall, millions beyond, and he welcomed them. Close up, the faces came into view. A man in a dark suit, lips pressed tight, skeptical. A woman near the front, fingers clasped, hopeful. A young staffer, barely out of college, wide-eyed with the intensity of witnessing history unfold. JD let the silence stretch just a heartbeat longer, feeling its weight, respecting it. This was not a moment for rushing. It was a moment to gather the voices he represented. The mothers who worked 2 jobs and still fell behind. The fathers who had buried their pride along with their paychecks. The children who dreamed of something better but didn't know what that looked like anymore. His hand brushed the note card in his pocket, and for the briefest moment, he felt the words scribbled on its back. The widow's plea, like a promise he was about to keep. The cameras blinked once more, their red lights steady now. JD lifted his chin, drew in a breath, and prepared to speak. Not for himself, not for applause, but for the silent storm of voices waiting to be heard. JD Vance stood at the podium, the weight of the room pressing in, but his heart beat with a steady purpose. The silence that met him was no longer uncertain. It was expectant, taut as a drawn bow. His fingers brushed the edge of the microphone, and he leaned forward slightly, letting his voice carry, not loud, but firm enough that every corner of the grand hall would hear. "Governor," JD began, his tone even, his words deliberate, "you speak of broken promises, but promises broken are better than promises never made, or worse, promises never tried." A ripple moved through the audience, a subtle shift in posture, a lean forward here, a caught breath there. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, with a quiet force, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. He held DeSantis's gaze for a moment, not with hostility, but with the unflinching look of a man who had lived the consequences of inaction, who spoke not from politics, but from experience. JD's hand rested briefly on the podium, grounding him as he continued. "I've seen what happens when we let fear of failure keep us from trying. I've stood at the edge of towns hollowed out by promises never made. I've met the families terrorized by cartels who slip across borders we leave unguarded. And I've looked into the eyes of border agents who died on duty, men and women who believed in those promises, who put on that uniform and stood between danger and our people." The room was still now, the air thick with the weight of his words. Cameras zoomed in, catching the intensity in his eyes, the slight tremor of emotion in his voice. Not weakness, but the strength of someone speaking for those who could not. JD's voice dropped just slightly, drawing the audience in. "I think of Officer Ramirez, a man I met at a small memorial on the southern border. He was off duty when he saw traffickers moving in on a family. He didn't hesitate. He gave his life trying to protect them. His widow told me something I'll never forget. She said, he died believing the wall would be finished, believing it mattered. And I ask you tonight, Governor, does it not matter anymore? DeSantis shifted in his seat, his expression controlled, but JD could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes. The crowd was listening, not to the debate of policies, but to the story of a man, a sacrifice, a promise that had meant something. JD let the silence that followed his question linger. The kind of silence that demanded reflection. The kind that made people uncomfortable because it forced them to think. He drew a breath, steadying his voice for what came next. We can argue numbers, we can debate budgets, but I stand here tonight not for sound bites or applause. I stand for the families who lock their doors at night and pray for dawn. I stand for the workers who don't know if their factory will still be open next month. I stand for those who still believe this country keeps its word. The room held its breath as JD stepped back from the mic, his words left hanging in the air, unanswered. For now. But the first strike had been made. And it wasn't about politics, it was about a promise. For a beat, the hall stayed silent, JD's words echoing in the minds of those who'd heard them. Then Ron DeSantis shifted forward, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair as he rose again. The smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth wasn't one of amusement, but of calculation, the expression of a man who saw an opening and meant to take it. He walked back to the podium, his steps measured, his posture firm. He didn't bother to glance at JD as he passed, his gaze fixed on the audience, the cameras, the prize beyond this hall. Look, DeSantis began, his voice smooth, almost conversational, but sharpened at the edges. I respect the passion, I really do. But emotional appeals won't balance the budget or secure our nation. They won't stop the flood of illegal crossings or erase the mountain of debt we're bearing our children under. His eyes scanned the audience, picking up on the nods, the furrowed brows of those who wanted answers more than stories, plans more than pleas. DeSantis placed his hands on the podium, leaning forward slightly as if confiding in the crowd. In Florida, we didn't wait for Washington to keep promises. We made our own success. We secured our borders, defended our communities, balanced our budget. That's what real leadership looks like. Not unfinished walls, not empty words. Action. His voice grew firmer, his confidence building as he painted the contrast between what he framed as Florida's decisiveness and federal failure. Every phrase was crafted to jab, subtly but surely, at both J.D. Vance's defense of Trump's efforts and at the larger national shortcomings J.D. had tried to dignify with his stories. J.D. stood at his podium, listening, heart pounding, not from fear but from the swell of frustration, of urgency. He could feel the narrative shifting, DeSantis's words weaving doubt among those who'd been moved just moments before. The governor was skilled. J.D. would grant him that. He knew how to turn a crowd, how to redirect the emotional current toward his own ends. J.D.'s hand moved almost unconsciously to the note card in his pocket. His thumb traced the worn edge of the card, felt the faint indent of the ink on its back. He didn't need to pull it out. He knew the words by heart. He died believing the wall would be finished, believing it mattered. The widow's voice echoed in his mind, soft but unwavering, as clear now as the day she'd spoken them. DeSantis wasn't finished. His voice softened, as if to wrap the room in his reason. We honor sacrifice best by getting results, not by repeating mistakes. I will never disrespect the men and women who serve, but I will say this, their legacy deserves solutions that work, and that means thinking beyond the same broken promises. He stepped back from the podium with a small nod, as though settling the matter, as though his logic, his record, his plan had sealed the case. The audience shifted again, some swayed by his confidence, others watching J.D., waiting, wondering if the man who'd spoken with such heart could answer this challenge. And J.D.? He drew in a slow breath, his pulse steadying, his focus sharpening. Because he knew, beyond the figures, beyond the plans, what the people of this nation were asking tonight wasn't just what could be done. It was who would stand up, not when it was easy, but when it mattered most. J.D. Vance stood still for a breath, feeling the weight of DeSantis's words settle over the room like a challenge thrown at his feet. The governor's polished arguments, his easy confidence, they'd landed where he aimed them. J.D. could see it in the subtle shift of faces, in the pause before people dared to react. But JD wasn't here to match polish with polish. He was here to remind this room, and the nation beyond it, of the cost of looking away. He stepped closer to the microphone, his hands resting lightly on the podium's edge, his voice steady, not raised, but carried by conviction that needed no theatrics. "You're right about one thing, Governor," JD began, his gaze sweeping the room, pausing just long enough to let his words take root. "Action matters, but so does truth. And here's the truth. When we turned our backs on the promise of securing our border, we didn't just leave a project unfinished. We left families unprotected, communities broken, lives lost." The room grew still, the earlier energy shifting again, as if the crowd sensed a different current beneath JD's voice, one that spoke not in platitudes or sound bites, but in hard, painful facts. JD's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The numbers spoke loudly enough. Since the work on that wall stalled, border communities have seen overdoses spike by 40%. Fentanyl and meth streaming across gaps we left open. In Ohio, in my own home district, we lost 800 people last year alone to overdose deaths linked directly to smuggling routes that should have been closed. 800 families planning funerals. 800 empty chairs at dinner tables. His words struck the air like hammer blows, deliberate, unflinching. JD could see it in the faces now, the shift, the discomfort, the recognition of realities too often buried beneath politics. And as those factories shut their doors, as jobs moved overseas, what did we give those towns to hold on to? Promises of retraining? Grants that never came? Or did we just give speeches and walk away while they crumbled? A murmur started in the back of the hall, soft at first, then spreading like the first hint of wind before a storm. JD didn't look toward it. He didn't need to. He felt it, the stirring of something real, something no poll or pundit could manufacture. JD let the pause stretch, meeting the eyes of a woman near the front, her hands clasped tightly together, the glint of tears on her lashes catching the stage lights. "We can talk about budgets, we can talk about plans, but none of that means anything if we don't tell the truth about what's happening to our people, and what will keep happening if we choose safe words over hard actions." Then it happened, a single pair of hands clapping, hesitant at first. Another joined, and another. The ripple moved across the hall, tentative but growing, until it was no longer a ripple, but a rising tide. Not thunderous, not yet, but real. And beyond those walls, phones lit up. Screens flickered as millions watched the moment unfold. Social media feeds flooded with a single phrase that began to trend. #Vance speaks for us. JD stood at the podium, not triumphant, but resolute. The room had shifted, the nation had begun to listen, and the storm was only just beginning. The applause from the hall softened, the ripple of support settling into a silence that felt different now. Not the guarded quiet of skepticism, but the kind that comes when people are ready to listen. JD Vance let that silence breathe, let it fill the room like a shared understanding. He gripped the edges of the podium gently, his gaze sweeping across faces no longer indifferent, faces that had begun to feel the weight of his words. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself not because of nerves, but because what he was about to share deserved that kind of care. "There's a woman in Ohio I think about every time I stand at a podium like this," JD began, his voice lower now, drawing the room in closer. "Her name's not important tonight, because she could be any of 1,000 mothers across this country, any of the families we promised to fight for and failed." He paused just long enough for the weight of that failure to sink in. She worked at a local plant, the kind of place that once kept a town alive, a place where generations clocked in, proud to put in an honest day's work. And then one day, that plant closed. Not because demand dried up, not because the workers failed, but because cheaper imports came flooding in. Because somewhere a deal was signed that made numbers look good on paper and hollowed out a community. JD could see them now, the audience leaning in, drawn not by theatrics, but by the simple, painful truth of the story. She did everything right. She took double shifts at a diner. She tried to make the rent. She skipped meals so her kids wouldn't have to. And still, I sat in her kitchen one night, and she showed me the eviction notice. The same house she'd lived in since she was a girl, the house her kids thought they'd grow up in, slipping through her fingers like sand. His voice faltered, just slightly, enough to let the emotion show without drowning his purpose. The hall was utterly still now, the kind of stillness that fills a space where people are holding their breath. I remember the sound of her little boy's stomach growling while we talked, JD continued, his voice softer still. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. That sound, that hunger, said everything about what we've allowed to happen in this country. He looked out at the hall, at the glint of tears in the eyes of a woman seated near the front, at the clenched jaw of a man in a suit who had, until this moment, listened with arms crossed and doubt on his face. JD drew in a breath, steadying himself again. This isn't about pointing fingers at the past. It's about deciding what we do next. Because that mother, and mothers like her, don't have time for speeches. They need us to keep promises. They need us to stop talking about solutions and start delivering them. The silence held a beat longer, thick with the emotion of the moment. And somewhere, perhaps in the back of the hall, or maybe far beyond these walls, another ripple began. Small but real, the kind that grows. JD let his hands fall to his sides, not in surrender, but in quiet defiance of apathy. The room was his now, not for glory, not for victory, but for the people he spoke for, and they were listening. The room remained suspended in that heavy silence after JD's story of the Ohio mother. Hearts and minds caught in the image of a family brought to its knees by promises broken and dreams betrayed. JD let the moment linger just long enough before he lifted his gaze again, his voice steady, but carrying an edge sharpened by grief and resolve. And it isn't just the families left behind by shuttered factories or jobs sent overseas, he continued, his voice lower now, inviting the hall to lean in again. It's the families who've buried sons and daughters who stood on the front lines where we failed to act. The room quieted further, if that were possible, the weight of what was coming settling over the audience like a gathering storm. JD gripped the podium, his knuckles pale, not from nerves but from the sheer gravity of the memory he now shared. There was a man I met last year, a father from New Mexico, JD began, his voice even, his words deliberate. His son served as a border agent, one of the best, a man who believed in duty and the oath he took to protect his community, his country. He was young, newly married, a child on the way. JD paused, letting the image form in the minds of those listening. A life just beginning, a family on the brink of new joy. During a cartel raid, he was ambushed. He fought, he fought, to protect the people in his town, to hold the line where policy failed. He died that night, shot down in the dark, trying to do what Washington wouldn't. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the audience, the sound of someone caught off guard by the rawness of it, by the reminder that policy wasn't just politics, it was life and death. JD's voice softened, and for a moment he wasn't speaking to the hall, but to the memory of that grieving father who had stood before him, broken but unbowed. I remember the father's eyes, hollowed out by loss but burning with something fierce. He handed me a folded piece of paper, trembling, and he said, JD's throat tightened and he swallowed hard before continuing. Tell them my son died doing what Washington wouldn't. The words landed in the room like a hammer, each syllable striking deeper than the last. JD looked out at the sea of faces, faces that moments ago had been skeptical, guarded, but were now transformed by the weight of his words. He saw tears glistening on cheeks that had worn skepticism like armor. He saw heads bowed, not in defeat, but in reflection. This isn't just about policy points or political wins, JD said, his voice gaining strength. It's about the lives that are lost while we argue, the families that mourn while we delay, the promises that mean the difference between life and death. He stepped back slightly, giving space for the room to absorb it all. The silence was no longer heavy with tension. It was filled with the solemn understanding that what JD spoke of was real and urgent and could no longer be ignored. And beyond those walls, as the nation watched, another wave of voices began to rise. Voices that whispered, posted, shared, hashtag Vance speaks for us. For a long, breathless moment, the hall seemed frozen in place, suspended between the grief JD had laid bare and the weight of its truth. The audience sat motionless, heads bowed or eyes fixed on JD with a kind of reverence that even JD himself hadn't sought. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred, the kind born from shared understanding and collective sorrow. But then Ron DeSantis shifted. He had to. The silence that had become JD's ally now threatened to swallow him whole if he didn't act. His fingers drummed lightly against the side of the podium as he rose, smoothing his jacket in a practiced motion. His face wore the controlled mask of a man determined to steady the ship, to seize back the ground that had slipped from beneath him. DeSantis stepped forward, his voice measured, polished, confident on the surface. But beneath that practiced tone, there was an edge, not of strength, but of strain. "We can honor heroes without sinking into debt or false promises," he began, his words crafted to sound reasonable, rational, above the fray of emotion. "We can secure our nation without bankrupting it. We can protect our families without building walls that don't work." The words filled the space, but they didn't move the room. They landed not like a rallying cry, but like echoes against stone. JD's stories, the mother's eviction notice, the border agent's sacrifice, still lingered in the air, too fresh, too raw to be countered by talking points. DeSantis continued, trying to regain his footing. "Florida faced challenges too. We took action, but we didn't let our budget spiral. We didn't promise what couldn't be delivered. We focused on results." But the audience wasn't leaning in now. They weren't nodding as they had before. Some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between DeSantis and JD, as if comparing not just words, but weight, sincerity, purpose. DeSantis tried again, softening his tone as if to bridge the gap that had opened between himself and the crowd. "Every life lost is a tragedy. Every family's pain is real. But we can't let grief cloud judgment. We have to be clear-eyed, disciplined. That's what leadership demands." He waited as if expecting applause, or at least a murmur of agreement. But the hall remained still. The words felt hollow in the wake of what had come before. The logic sound, perhaps, but the heart of the room wasn't in it. JD stood quietly at his podium, saying nothing, doing nothing, but his presence alone was enough. The stories he'd shared hadn't been grand declarations or sweeping plans. They'd been truth, and truth tonight spoke louder than any polished defense. DeSantis glanced at the crowd, his smile tight, his shoulders squared as if bracing against an unseen wind. He had said what he came to say, but he knew, and they knew, that something had shifted. The storm JD brought had not passed. It had gathered strength. And beyond the cameras, in living rooms across America, social media continued to light up. Hashtag Vance speaks for us wasn't fading. It was surging. DeSantis stepped back, his words delivered, his case made. But the hall belonged to JD now, not by force, not by showmanship, but by the simple, undeniable power of speaking for the people who had waited too long to be heard. The weight of DeSantis's final words still hung in the air, but they were thin now, faint echoes against the storm JD Vance had stirred. The hall remained hushed, the crowd not hostile, but unmoved, waiting for something real to anchor them again. JD felt that silence, felt the fragile moment that could either pass or be seized, and he knew what he had to do. Slowly, without a word at first, he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers finding the worn, crumpled edge of the letter he had carried with him all this time. He drew it out gently, as if it might tear from the weight of what it contained. His hand trembled, not from nerves, but from the gravity of sharing something so raw, so private, in front of so many. JD unfolded the paper with care, the soft crackle of its creases the only sound in the vast room. His eyes scanned the familiar lines once more, though he no longer needed to read them. He knew every word by heart. But tonight, those words weren't meant to stay inside. They were meant for this room, for this nation. His voice came quiet at first, thick with emotion that he didn't try to hide. They took my husband, JD read, his voice breaking on the word husband. He paused, swallowing hard, willing himself to continue. The room had grown impossibly still, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. They took my husband. Don't let them take my boy. The simple plea echoed through the chamber, more powerful than any speech, any plan, any polished argument. The words of a widow who had already lost too much, now begging that her child not be the next casualty of promises unkept and actions delayed. JD's voice wavered as he read, the raw humanity of the letter stripping away the armor of politics, of debate, of defense. My son still believes in this country. He still believes in what his father fought for. Please, don't let that faith die with him. He lowered the letter, his eyes glistening but steady, his breath unsteady but his purpose clear. The cameras caught the tears that brimmed but did not fall, the reflection of stage lights on eyes that carried the sorrow of more than just one family. And then the cameras turned outward, capturing the faces in the hall. A woman near the front dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue. A grizzled man in a veteran's cap clenched his jaw, blinking hard against tears that threatened to fall. Even some of the staffers, the hardened political aides who had heard 1,000 speeches, felt the sting of emotion they hadn't expected. JD folded the letter again, carefully, as if tucking away a sacred trust. His voice steadied as he spoke, no longer reading, but speaking as himself, for all those like the woman who had written him. This isn't about debt. This isn't about party. This is about whether we still listen to the voices of those who have given everything, or whether we let them be drowned out by our fear of failing. The hall remained silent, not because it lacked the will to respond, but because it was held for just a moment longer in the grip of truth. And beyond these walls across America, people wiped their own tears as #Vance Speaks For Us surged like a tide that could not be stopped. The silence after JD's voice fell away was the kind that didn't just fill the room. It pressed into the hearts of everyone present, heavy, deafening, absolute. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the soft click of a camera shutter dared disturb it. The weight of the widow's words, the rawness of JD's voice, had left the grand hall breathless. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the room itself had forgotten how. The weight of sacrifice, of lives given, of families shattered, hung between marble columns and beneath the heavy banners that lined the walls. Then slowly from the middle rows, a figure rose. The man was older, his back straight despite the years that had tried to bend it, his face weathered by both time and duty. He wore a dark jacket, and on his head sat a cap faded by sun and memory, the gold embroidery of his unit barely visible now. A veteran. Without a word, he lifted his hand in a crisp salute. The motion was simple, but it carried more power than any applause could have. His hand trembled slightly as he held it there, eyes fixed not on the stage as a place of politics, but on JD as a man who had spoken a truth too often left unsaid. The cameras caught the moment, the veteran's salute, the glisten in his eye, the way his lips pressed together to keep emotion from breaking free. One by one, others rose, not in orchestrated show, not in choreographed response, but because something in them had been moved beyond calculation, beyond partisanship. A woman with silver hair and a flag pin over her heart. A young man in work boots and rolled-up sleeves. A mother with a toddler fidgeting beside her. And JD? He stood motionless, humbled by what he saw, understanding that this wasn't about him. It was about the people those salutes honored, about promises that must no longer be broken. Ron DeSantis, still at his podium, glanced at the rising crowd, his practiced composure faltering. His hands shifted on the edges of the lectern, his gaze dropping for a beat to the floor as if searching for words that wouldn't come. The sharpness that had defined him at the start of the night had dulled. His usual confidence cracked beneath the weight of what had been spoken, what had been felt. DeSantis cleared his throat as if to speak, but no sound came. The room wasn't his anymore, and he knew it. The storm JD had brought to the stage wasn't one that could be out-argued or out-managed. It was a storm of truths long ignored, and tonight they had found their voice. The cameras panned the hall, capturing the sea of faces. Solemn, resolute, changed. And beyond those walls, the ripples spread. On phones, on screens, in conversations whispered between neighbors, and shouted across social media feeds. Hashtag Vance Speaks For Us didn't just trend, it soared. The veteran lowered his salute at last, his eyes never leaving JD's. And JD, his voice steady now, nodded once. A gesture not of victory, but of shared understanding. The room had changed, and nothing said next would be able to undo it. The hall remained suspended in that powerful stillness, the kind that came not from uncertainty, but from shared understanding. The veteran's salute, the rising figures across the room, the silence of DeSantis at his podium, all of it formed the backdrop as J.D. Vance drew in a breath, steadying himself not because he was unsure, but because what he was about to say mattered. He stepped forward, away from the safety of the podium, into the full light of the stage. His voice, when it came, carried not as a shout, but as a vow. Low, firm, unshakable. I will not forget them. The words fell into the charged air like the toll of a bell, clear and solemn. JD's gaze moved over the crowd, not searching for approval, but for the faces of those who, like the mother he'd spoken of, like the father who'd buried his son, had waited too long to be seen. I will fight for them, JD continued, his voice gaining strength, with or without your applause, with or without your headlines, with or without your permission. Something shifted then, something more than just the mood in the room. It was as if the dam that had held back the crowd's voice all night finally broke. First one person rose, then another. The applause that began was not the polite, restrained kind so often heard in such halls. It was fierce. It was real. It was the sound of people who had heard not a politician, but a promise. JD didn't smile at the ovation. He didn't raise his hands to bask in it. He stood firm, grounded by the weight of what he'd pledged. This wasn't about a moment. It was about a mission. The cameras captured it all. The standing crowd, the faces wet with tears, the hands clapping until they burned. The flood of social media posts intensified. Hashtag Vance Speaks For Us, now joined by hashtag We Remember and hashtag JD Promise. DeSantis, still at his podium, seemed smaller now. His earlier confidence, his polished lines, all of it seemed hollow against the raw truth that filled the room. He glanced at JD, but JD didn't look his way. JD's eyes were on the people, on the future that had been too long neglected. JD lifted his voice one last time, letting it ring out across the hall. We owe them more than speeches. We owe them action. And tonight, let this be the night we remember who we're supposed to be. The applause swelled, not as noise, but as affirmation. A tide had turned. And in that moment, the stage belonged to JD, not because he'd won an argument, but because he'd reminded everyone of what mattered. He stepped back at last, the storm he had carried into the room now shared by all who stood before him. And though the cameras kept rolling, though the nation kept watching, JD knew this wasn't the end of a debate. It was the beginning of a promise that would have to be kept. The ovation still echoed through the hall, the sound of hands clapping, feet shifting, hearts stirred. But as the applause slowly ebbed, as the crowd began to settle back into their seats, J.D. Vance remained at the front of the stage, silent, composed, the weight of his promise still fresh in the air. The energy of the room had shifted unmistakably. Ron DeSantis, standing at his podium, saw it, felt it. The tide that had once been his was no longer so sure. His practiced calm didn't falter on the surface, but in his eyes was the flicker of a man recalculating. The moment was no longer his, but he wasn't ready to surrender it entirely. He drew in a breath, adjusted his jacket, and stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was smooth, measured, the voice of someone used to command. But tonight it carried an undertone that hadn't been there before. Not fear, but strain. I respect the passion, I truly do, DeSantis began, his words carefully chosen, his tone aiming for reason over rhetoric. And I honor the stories that have been shared tonight. But passion alone won't solve our challenges. We need clear eyes. We need steady hands. We need plans that work, not just promises that feel good in the moment. He let the words hang, hoping they'd strike the balance he sought, respectful, rational, above the fray. But the room's mood had changed. The crowd listened, but not with the hunger they'd had earlier. There was no leaning forward now, no eager nods, only watchful stillness. DeSantis pressed on, determined to reclaim the narrative. In Florida, we didn't just talk about protecting families. We did it. We balanced budgets. We secured communities. We kept taxes low while making smart investments. That's the kind of leadership we need now, for our nation. Not speeches, not applause lines. A plan. But the plan he offered next felt, even as he spoke it, thin. It was safe, vague, designed not to offend or inspire, but to check boxes. He spoke of task forces, of reviewing existing security measures, of partnerships with private industry, phrases that sounded familiar, that filled time but left no mark. He outlined ideas for a border security commission, for pilot programs to study workforce development, for panels to evaluate trade impacts. None of it was wrong. None of it stirred the room. DeSantis's gaze swept the hall as he spoke, seeking out the approval he'd once commanded, finding instead polite attention, respectful but unmoved. The crowd had shifted their weight, not just physically but in their hearts. Vance remained silent at his spot, watching, listening, his promise still ringing louder than any proposal. The room belonged to that promise now, to the people it honored, to the truth it demanded. And as DeSantis wrapped his remarks, his voice steady but his momentum lost, the hall responded not with rejection, but with a quiet that spoke volumes. The storm JD had unleashed still hung in the air, and DeSantis's words, however carefully crafted, could not push it back. The room had fallen into that heavy, thoughtful quiet again. DeSantis's words still lingered, but only as a faint echo against the storm Vance had unleashed earlier. His safe promises, his polished language. They hadn't stirred the crowd. They'd merely filled the space between the silence and what everyone was waiting for next. And now JD stepped forward once more. No longer just a voice among many, but the voice the room had come to trust tonight. His hands rested lightly on the podium, but there was no reliance on it for strength. The strength came from within, from the stories he carried, from the promises he'd made. His voice, when it rose again, was steady, sincere, no need for pretense. And yet, when the moment called for it, it burned with a quiet fire that demanded the room's full attention. "We've talked tonight about what hasn't worked," JD began, his eyes moving from face to face, anchoring his words not to the cameras but to the people. "But I don't believe in leaving it there. We owe more than complaints. We owe solutions. And not the kind that sound good in speeches and die in committee. Real solutions that can change lives." He drew in a breath, the hall leaning toward him, waiting. "We start by fixing the trade deals that hollowed out towns like mine. We stop selling out American workers for cheap imports. We make fair trade the law of this land. Trade that lifts our workers up, not ships their jobs out." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, small but growing. JD let it fuel him, but not distract him. "We secure our borders," he continued, his voice firm, but not harsh. "With more than promises, more than walls that get halfway done and abandoned. We secure them with technology where it works and with manpower where it's needed. We give our agents the tools they've begged for. We give our communities the protection they deserve." The words came not as boasts or declarations, but as vows. A blueprint drawn from what he'd seen, what he knew families were waiting for. "And we stop pretending that the future belongs to giant corporations alone," JD pressed on, his tone rising just enough to stir the room again. "We support our small manufacturers, our family businesses, the ones that built this country and still keep its heart beating. We give them a fighting chance to compete. We give them a future worth passing down." The applause started again. Not the slow, polite kind, but the kind that came from people who felt seen, felt heard, felt called to something higher. JD didn't pause for praise. He pressed on, his voice steady, his fire tempered by purpose. "I'm not here to offer a perfect plan. I'm here to offer a promise, that I will fight like hell to make sure the voices of the forgotten are no longer drowned out by the noise of politics, that I will work every day not for applause, not for headlines, but for the families counting on us to finally get this right. The hall was his now, not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it. And as the applause rose, as the crowd found its voice again, JD stood firm, ready for what came next. JD's final words still echoed in the grand hall, not just as sound, but as conviction. His voice had not been the loudest of the night, but it had been the truest. And now it filled the space in a way no speech, no polished plan, no clever retort could. The people in that room, and far beyond, felt it. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of breath held, of a nation waiting. Then the first voice rang out, tentative but clear, from somewhere near the front. "Protect America!" Another voice joined, louder this time, from the rows farther back. "Protect workers!" And then more, swelling like a wave that could no longer be stopped. "Protect America! Protect workers!" The chant rolled through the hall, gaining strength, becoming not just a reaction, but a declaration. It came from men in suits, from women in blouses and scarves, from students, from retirees. It came from the hopeful and the weary, from those who had doubted and now believed. JD didn't move, didn't gesture for quiet, didn't try to ride the moment for his own glory. He stood firm, humbled by the power of voices that had, for too long, been silenced by indifference and forgotten by politics. His eyes swept the room, not for approval, but for connection, with the people who mattered most. The cameras caught it all, the faces alight with purpose, the fists raised not in anger, but in solidarity. Social media feeds exploded with clips of the moment. Hashtags surging, hashtag protect America, hashtag protect workers, hashtag Vance speaks for us. And in that same hall at the edge of the stage, Ron DeSantis stood still, his figure almost fading into the background. The spotlight no longer sought him. The crowd no longer looked to him. His polished words, his cautious plans, had been drowned out, not by noise, but by the clarity of what the people now demanded. DeSantis's hands rested on the podium's edge, his grip tight, his expression composed but distant. His eyes followed the wave of the crowd's chant, but there was no place for him in it. What he offered tonight had been reasoned, calculated, but it hadn't been enough. JD let the chant fill the space, let it wash over him, not as victory, but as responsibility. The tide had turned. The room was no longer just listening. It was speaking, and JD understood. His promise was no longer his alone. It belonged to them now. He raised his hand once, not to silence, but to honor the crowd, to acknowledge their voice, their power. The chant softened, but the energy remained, alive in the air, in the hearts of those present. JD drew in a breath, steady, strong. "This is our country to protect," he said, his voice carrying above the quiet. "Our workers to stand for, our promises to keep, together." And the hall erupted once more, not in anger, not in partisanship, but in shared purpose. The people had decided. The chant still hummed like an undercurrent in the great hall, their echoes fading not because the passion was gone, but because the people had said what needed saying. And now they waited. Waited for the man who had given voice to their frustration, their hope, their demand for something better. JD Vance stood at the podium, the weight of the night visible in the set of his shoulders, in the quiet strength of his gaze. The camera zoomed close, capturing not a man seeking glory, but one carrying the burden of promises made, and the determination to see them kept. He let the room breathe for a beat longer, his eyes meeting those before him and those far beyond, watching through screens across the nation. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, no longer fiery with the heat of debate, but firm with the resolve of truth. "This isn't about Trump," JD began, his words clear, each one chosen with care. "It isn't about me. It isn't about any one name or any one party." He paused, letting that sink in, letting it strip away the labels. the distractions, the divisions that had clouded too many nights like this. This is about every American forgotten by the powerful. Every family that watched their factory close and wondered how they'd feed their kids. Every border town that begged for help and got speeches instead. Every parent who buried a child because Washington argued while cartels moved drugs across our soil. The hall was silent again, but this time it was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of listening, of people leaning in, wanting more, not of promises, but of purpose. JD's voice softened, but carried no less power. I've seen what happens when leaders turn their backs. I grew up in the shadows of their choices. And I swore to myself, long before I stood on any stage, that if I ever had the chance to speak for those voices, the voices that never get heard, I would. His gaze swept the hall, caught the eyes of the veteran who had saluted him, the mother near the front who had wept quietly during his tale of the border agent, the workers who had risen in the chant. And tonight I'm keeping that promise, not because it's easy, not because it's popular, but because it's right. The cameras caught it all, the resolve, the sincerity, the quiet fire that had not dimmed through the storm of this debate, but had grown stronger. JD drew in a breath, let it out slow, steady. This nation doesn't need more speeches. It needs action. It needs courage. It needs all of us, every one of us, to remember who we are and who we're supposed to fight for. And I promise you this, I won't forget, I won't stop, and I won't stand down. A hush hung over the room, not because there was nothing to say, but because for a moment, no one wanted to break what had been shared. And then the applause began, not driven by politics, but by the shared recognition that something real had just been spoken. The final notes of JD's words still echoed in the room, not as sound, but as something far more powerful. A promise that reached past politics, past the stage, into the very hearts of those watching. The applause that followed wasn't rushed or frenzied. It was steady, strong, the sound of people who knew they had just witnessed something that mattered. And then slowly, the applause softened, but the energy remained, thick, electric, like the charged air before a storm breaks. All eyes turned, almost as one, toward the other podium, toward the man who had entered this debate certain of his command of the room, of the narrative, of the nation's attention. Ron DeSantis stood there, his figure framed by the flags and columns that had once seemed to lend him strength. But now they only served as a backdrop to the stillness that had overtaken him. His hands rested on the lectern's edge, his grip firm as if anchoring himself against the tide that had so clearly turned. He opened his mouth perhaps to speak, perhaps to salvage something from the wreckage of what had been expected tonight. But no words came. The rehearsed lines, the polished phrases, they felt hollow now. How could they stand beside what had just been spoken? The cameras zoomed in, catching the faint furrow in his brow, the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. DeSantis, a man known for sharp comebacks, for crisp retorts, for controlling the moment, stood frozen. And in that stillness, the hall felt the shift not just of a debate, but of something larger. J.D. Vance didn't move. He didn't need to. The power of the moment wasn't in motion or noise. It was in the truth that had been laid bare, and in the quiet that followed, when no one could deny it. DeSantis's eyes moved across the room, searching for what, it wasn't clear. A lifeline, a point of re-entry, a way to recapture the ground that had slipped beneath him. But there was none. The moment no longer belonged to him. The crowd sensed it, as surely as they sensed history being made. They had come for a debate, for plans and policies, for the clash of ideas. What they had found instead was clarity. The kind that doesn't come often, the kind that speaks not to politics, but to purpose. A woman near the front wiped at her eyes, the last of her tears drying now, not from sorrow, but from the quiet strength she had witnessed. A man in work boots and a flannel shirt crossed his arms, not in defiance, but in resolve. A teacher in the back whispered to her neighbor, This is what we've been waiting for." DeSantis remained still, his silence louder than any words he might have spoken. And the cameras kept rolling, the nation kept watching, and the truth of the night settled over them all. The moment belonged to J.D. Vance. The night had ended, but its echoes carried on. Across the country, in living rooms and coffee shops, on factory floors and farmhouses, the same images replayed on endless loops. J.D. Vance, standing tall as the voice of those long ignored, and DeSantis, silent, unable to match the weight of what had been spoken. And now, as the first light of dawn broke across the Ohio hills, J.D. Vance sat alone on the worn steps of his porch, the cool air of morning brushing against his face. The house behind him was quiet, the world not yet fully awake. But already his phone buzzed with messages, alerts, and headlines. J.D. Vance's night, the voice of the working class. Vance captures the nation's heart, but can he deliver? DeSantis falters in face of Vance's truth. He had not come home for the headlines. He had not come home for the praise or the speculation. He had come home because this was where the promises began. Not on a stage, not before cameras, but here where people lived with the consequences of what politicians chose to remember or forget. The weight of the night settled over him, heavier now in the stillness than it had been beneath the lights. The storm in the hall had passed, but J.D. knew better than to think the work was done. The true battle was only beginning. He stared out over the fields beyond his yard, where the first rays of sunlight glinted off the frost-dusted grass. In that quiet, he heard again the voices of those he'd spoken for. The widow's plea, the father's grief, the mother's fear as eviction loomed. He heard the chants that had filled the hall. Protect America. Protect workers. They weren't just chants now. They were a charge, a responsibility. J.D. ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. The storm on stage had been one thing. Now came the harder part, turning words into action, promises into reality. And he knew with every fiber of his being, that there would be resistance. There would be critics, obstacles, forces that would try to drown out the voices he had promised to lift up. But the night before had given him more than headlines. It had given him the strength that comes from knowing you've spoken the truth, no matter the cost. In the distance, a rooster crowed, the world shaking off the last of night's hold. J.D. stood slowly, his legs stiff from the long hours. He looked at his home, modest and worn, but filled with meaning. And he looked at the road beyond, knowing it stretched far, knowing it would not be easy. But easy had never been the point. He slipped his phone into his pocket, ignoring the buzz of yet another alert. The headlines could wait. The work could not. And as the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the land he loved, J.D. Vance stepped down from the porch and into the dawn of what came next. The sun rose higher over Ohio, and with it, the country began to stir. Not just from sleep, but from the weight of what it had witnessed the night before. J.D.'s words had not stayed confined to that grand hall, nor to the glow of television screens. They had taken root in hearts across the nation, and now those hearts stirred with purpose. In small towns and cities alike, people gathered, in libraries, in school gyms, in union halls and church basements. Places that had, for too long, been empty during civic meetings, now filled with faces both old and young, drawn not by party, but by the promise of being heard. They came with questions, with ideas, with demands, and above all, with hope. In Iowa, a town hall overflowed, citizens crowding into aisles, leaning against walls, straining to hear and to speak. In Pennsylvania, a community meeting that had once drawn a dozen now brought in hundreds. In Arizona, border town residents packed a school auditorium, united not by fear, but by the determination that the promises made on stage would not be allowed to fade. And in the halls of power, lawmakers felt it. The emails, the calls, the letters poured in, not in anger, but in insistence. Do something. Proposals began to surface. A bill aimed at protecting small manufacturers. A bipartisan draft for modern border security funding, blending technology with boots on the ground. A trade commission tasked with renegotiating deals that had hollowed out communities. The ripple had become a wave, and at the center of it stood J.D. Vance, not basking in the spotlight, but carrying the responsibility of having started something that now could not, must not, be stopped. The true work had begun. The wave of town halls, proposals, and renewed civic energy had begun to reshape the conversation in Washington. But for J.D. Vance, the true measure of change wasn't in headlines or draft bills. It was in the places where promises had been broken and hope had run thin. And so, only days after that unforgettable night, he found himself walking the cracked streets of a battered factory town, the kind of place that could have been his own once. The morning sky was gray, clouds hanging low over rows of boarded-up shops and rusted factory gates. J.D. moved quietly through the town square, nodding to those who passed, listening more than he spoke. He didn't come with cameras or speeches today. He came to see, to hear. At the edge of the square, near the remnants of a playground whose paint had long since peeled away, a small voice stopped him. "Mister?" J.D. turned. There, standing with one hand clutching a worn backpack, was a boy no older than 7, his coat too thin for the chilly air, his eyes too knowing for his years. "Will you help my dad get his job back?" the boy asked, his voice a whisper, as if afraid the hope in his question might break if spoken too loud. The world seemed to fall away in that instant. The noise of politics, the weight of plans, the storm of public debate, all that remained was the boy's gaze, steady, fragile, filled with more courage than any child should have to carry. J.D. felt the question hit deeper than any applause, deeper than any chant. He knelt, eye to eye with the boy, his voice soft but sure. "That's why I'm here," J.D. said. "No promise of easy answers, no false comfort. Just the truth, in the vow that had brought him to this moment." The boy nodded as if that was all he needed for now. J.D. rose, the square stretching out before him, the road ahead still long, but clearer than ever. The small town faded behind him as J.D. Vance drove through the early morning quiet, the world still wrapped in shadows, the sky just beginning to shift from black to gray. The boy's question echoed in his mind, as clear and haunting as when it had first been spoken. "Will you help my dad get his job back?" J.D. had answered, but he knew the work had only begun. He stopped where the road ended, where the empty shells of factories stood like silent witnesses to promises broken long ago. The air was cold, the ground damp with dew, and the horizon bled gold as the first light of day crept upward. J.D. stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel and weeds that had claimed what industry had abandoned. He walked slowly toward the fence that ringed the factory grounds, the rusted metal a reminder of what once was. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, its walls scarred by time and neglect. And yet, in the dawn light, it didn't look defeated. It looked waiting for what might come next. J.D. stood there alone, the rising sun casting him in silhouette, a solitary figure against the vastness of what had been lost. He didn't think of cameras or crowds or polls. He thought of the mother's letter, the border agent's father, the veteran's salute, the boy's whispered plea, and he spoke, not for the world to hear, but for himself, a vow as much as a promise. "I spoke under the lights," he said quietly, his breath misting in the cold. "Now I fight in the dark, until they are heard." The wind carried his words away, but their meaning stayed, etched into the morning, into the empty factory, into the road that stretched ahead. The headlines would fade, the applause would quiet, but the work, the real work, waited. And J.D. Vance, standing there as the sun rose over forgotten ground, knew he would not turn away, he would not stop. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't measured by applause or headlines, but by the courage to stand for those who feel forgotten. J.D. Vance's journey in this tale shows how powerful it is when a leader chooses to listen before speaking, to act before boasting. His promise wasn't built on empty slogans, but on the hard truth that real change begins when we see each other. When we hear the quiet struggles behind every closed factory door, behind every family's hardship. What moves me most is that J.D. didn't claim victory. Instead, he stepped into the shadows, knowing that the fight for dignity, jobs, and fairness is not won in one night. It's a long road walked in service to others. This story leaves us with a powerful question. In our own lives, big or small, where can we choose to stand for what's right, even when no one is watching? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of JD's journey spoke to you the most? Let's reflect together. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.